first-class courier who had arrived from Paris at Dresden, and whose dispatches were read to the emperor, as I have said, was the bearer of several letters for me, from my family, and 2 or 3 of my friends, and all those who have followed His Majesty on his campaigns in any capacity whatever know how precious is the news he receives from his own people. They wrote me, I remember, about a famous suit then in progress before the court of Assizes between Michel the banker and Renier. This scandalous affair made so much noise in the capital that it almost divided with the army news the interest and attention of the public. They wrote me also about the journey which the Empress was about to make to Cherbourg to be present at the rupture of the dikes and the invasion of the harbor by the sea. This journey, as may be imagined, had been advised by the emperor, who sought every occasion to bring the Empress before the public and make her perform acts of sovereignty as regent of the empire. She convoked and presided over the Council of Ministers, and I have more than once beheld the Emperor felicitating himself after the Austrian declaration of war because his Louise, as he called her, was entirely devoted to the interests of France and had nothing Austrian about her but her birth. Hence he left to her the satisfaction of publishing herself and in her own name all the official news from the army. No bulletins were drawn up any longer. The news was transmitted to her, all written out, and there is no doubt that the object of his attention on the part of His Majesty was to render the Empress Regent more popular by making her the intermediary of governmental communications to the public. Moreover, it is strictly true that we, who were on the spot, though we were immediately informed of the winning of a battle or an unlucky reverse, were very often ignorant of the ensemble of the operations of the various corps maneuvering over an immense line, except through the means of the Parisian newspapers. It may be fancied then how eager we were to read them. Chapter 9. During the second day of the Battle of Dresden, at the close of which His Majesty experienced the access of fever of which I have spoken in the preceding chapter, the King of Naples, or rather Marshal Murat, had performed prodigies of valor. Much has been said of this truly extraordinary prince, but only those who have seen him can form an exact idea concerning him, and even then they would know him but imperfectly if they had not seen him on the field of battle. There he was like those great actors who produce a complete illusion amidst the enchantments of the stage, but who do not resemble heroes in private life. Whenever in Paris I was present at a representation of Luce de Lanceval's Mort d'Hector, I never listened to the verses in which the author describes the effect produced on the Trojan army by the appearance of Achilles without thinking of Prince Murat. And it may be said, without exaggeration, that his presence produced the same effect as soon as he showed himself in front of the Austrian lines, being naturally of an almost gigantic figure, which would have sufficed to render him remarkable. He further sought all possible means of attracting notice, as if he wished to dazzle those he sought to strike. His regular and strongly marked countenance, his beautiful blue eyes, rolling in their orbits, enormous whiskers and black hair falling in ringlets on the collar of a kurtka with tight sleeves, astonished at first glance. Add to this the richest and most elegant costume that anyone ever thought of wearing, even on the stage, a Polish coat embroidered in the most brilliant manner and clasped by a gilded belt from which depended the scabbard of a light saber with a straight and pointed blade without an edge and without a guard, wide trousers of amaranthine purple embroidered in gold on the sleeves, and Nanking bottines, a big hat embroidered in gold and surmounted by 4 large ostrich feathers, from the midst of which rose a magnificent tuft of heron plumes, and lastly the horse of the king, chosen from among the strongest and largest that could be found, covered with a long sky blue housing, magnificently embroidered and kept in place by a saddle of Hungarian or Turkish shape, curiously wrought, and accompanied by a bridle and stirrups, not exceeded in richness by the rest of the equipment. All these things combined to make the King of Naples a being by himself, an object of terror and of admiration. But what idealized him, so to say, was a bravery that was veritably chivalrous and frequently urged even to temerity, as if danger ought not to exist for him. Besides, his temerity was far from displeasing to the emperor, without always approving the use to which it was put. His Majesty seldom failed to praise it, above all when he thought it needful to oppose it to the increasing prudence of some of his ancient companions in arms. On the 28th, the emperor visited the field of battle, which presented the most frightful spectacle. He gave orders that the sufferings of the wounded should be alleviated as much as possible, and those of the inhabitants, the peasants, whose houses and fields had been ravaged, burned and pillaged, and afterwards ascended the heights whence he could watch the march of the retreating army. Nearly all the attendants had followed him in this excursion. There was brought to him a peasant from Nutlitz, a small village where the Emperor Alexander and the King of Prussia had had their headquarters on the 2 preceding days. This peasant, interrogated by the Duke de Vicenza, said that he had seen a great personage brought to Nutlitz who had been wounded the day before in the midst of the Allied staff. He was riding beside the Emperor of Russia at the moment when he was struck, and the Emperor seemed to take the keenest interest in his fate. He had been carried to the headquarters of Nutlitz. On the crossed pikes of Cossacks, nothing had been found to cover him with but a mantle soaked with rain. On reaching Nutlitz, the Emperor Alexander's surgeon had amputated both his legs and sent him on a couch to Diepoldeswalde, escorted by several detachments, Austrian, Prussian, and Russian. On learning these details, the Emperor persuaded himself that this must be the Prince of Schwarzenberg. He was a brave man, said he, and I regret him. Then, after a silent pause, His Majesty resumed, "Then it is he who purges the fatality. That occurrence at the ball has always weighed on my heart as a sinister omen. It is very evident now that the omen was intended for him." However, while the emperor was indulging in this sort of conjectures and recalling his former presentiments, the prisoners brought before His Majesty were interrogated, and he learned that Prince Schwarzenberg had not been wounded, that he was in good health, and had directed the retreat of the Austrian Grand Army. Who then was the important personage who had been struck by a French ball? Conjectures were beginning anew on this point when Prince de Neuchatel received from an envoy of the King of Saxony a collar taken from the neck of a stray dog which had been found at Nutlitz. It was engraved with the words, "I belong to General Moreau." Still, this was merely an indication, but the suspicions it gave rise to were soon confirmed by abundant information. Thus, Moreau received his death blow, the first time that he bore arms against his country after having so often braved with impunity the fire of her enemies. History has passed an irrevocable sentence on him. Nevertheless, in spite of the enmity which had long existed between them, I can affirm that the emperor did not hear of his death without emotion, indignant though he was that so famous a French general should have taken arms against France and donned the Russian cockade. This unexpected death produced a great effect in both camps. Our soldiers beheld in it a just punishment from heaven and a favorable presage for the emperor. However that might be, here are some details which came afterwards to my knowledge, such as they were related by the valet de chambre of General Moreau. The 3 sovereigns of Russia, Austria, and Prussia had watched the fighting on the 27th from the heights of Nutlitz, whence they had departed as soon as they saw that the day had gone against them. That same day, General Moreau had been wounded by a cannonball near the entrenchments established before Dresden. Towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he was taken to the country seat of a banker named Salir at Nutlitz, where the emperors of Russia and Austria had established their headquarters. Both legs of the general were amputated below the knee. After the amputation, he asked for something to eat and a cup of tea. 3 fried eggs and some tea were offered him, but he took nothing but the tea. Towards 7 o'clock, he was placed on a stretcher and borne to Passendorf by Russian soldiers. He spent the night in the country house of Monsieur Tritcher, Grand Master of the Forest. There he took nothing but another cup of tea and complained greatly of his sufferings. The next day, August 28. He was transported again by Russian soldiers from Passendorf to Diepolzewalde, where he had a little white bread and a glass of lemonade at the house of a baker named Watz. An hour later, he was taken still near the frontiers of Bohemia. Russian soldiers carried him in the body of a coach detached from the train. During this passage, the cries wrung from him by the intensity of his pains were incessant. Such are the details I received at the time concerning Moreau's catastrophe, and it is well known that the general did not long survive his wound. The same ball which broke his 2 legs carried off an arm from Prince Ypsilanti, then an aide-de-camp of the Emperor Alexander, so that if the harm that one inflicts could repair the harm that one suffers, one might say that the ball which took General Kirchner and Marshal Duroc away from us was that day sent back to the enemy. But alas, those are melancholy consolations which one extracts from reprisals. It is plain from the preceding pages, and especially from what appeared to be the decisive winning of the Battle of Dresden, that wherever our troops were sustained by the all-powerful presence of the Emperor, they always gained advantages. Unluckily, it was not the same at several remote points on the line of operations. However, seeing the Allies routed by the army that he commanded in person, sure, moreover, that General Van Damme would have maintained the position he had indicated to him through General Axo, His Majesty returned to his first idea of marching on Berlin. He was already making his preparations to do so when the fatal tidings came that Van Damme, the victim of his own temerity, had vanished from the field of battle, and that his 10,000 men, hemmed in on all sides and overwhelmed by the enemy, had been cut to pieces. Van Damme was supposed to be dead, and it was only by later tidings that we learned that he had been taken prisoner with a part of his troops. We also learned that Van Damme, carried away by his natural intrepidity and unable to resist his desire to attack an enemy whom he saw within his reach, had quitted his defiles. For that purpose he had conquered at first, but when, after his victory, he attempted to resume his position, he found it occupied by Prussians who had seized it. Then he fought with the courage of despair, but all in vain, and General Kleist, proud of this fine trophy, led him to Prague in triumph. It was in speaking of Van Damme's audacious attempt that the Emperor employed that fine expression which has so justly been admired: for a flying enemy, you must make a bridge of gold, or oppose to him a wall of steel. The Emperor listened with his habitual calmness to the details of the losses he had just experienced. Nevertheless, his words more than once expressed the astonishment caused him by Van Damme's deplorable temerity. He could not get over the fact that so experienced a general should have allowed himself to be drawn from his position. But the harm was done, and in such cases the Emperor never lost time in empty recriminations. "Come," said he, addressing the Duc de Bassano, "you've just heard. That is war. Away up in the morning, and away down in the evening." After various orders given to the enemy and its leaders, the Emperor left Dresden in the evening of September 3 to try and regain what had been lost by the audacious imprudence of General Van Damme. But this check, the first we had experienced since the resumption of hostilities, was like the signal for the long series of reverses which awaited us. One might have said that victory, making a final effort in our favor at Dresden, was at last weary. The remainder of the campaign was but a series of disasters aggravated by treasons of every description and terminated by the horrible catastrophe at Leipzig. Even before quitting Dresden, we had heard of the desertion to the enemy of a Westphalian regiment with arms and baggage. The Emperor left Marshal Saint-Cyr in Dresden with 30,000 men and orders to hold out to the last extremity. He desired to save this capital at all costs. September passed in marches and counter-marches around the city without any events of decisive importance. Alas, the Emperor was never again to see the garrison of Dresden. Circumstances becoming more difficult made it imperative on His Majesty to oppose a prompt obstacle to the progress of the Allies. The King of Saxony, a rare model of fidelity among kings, wished to accompany the Emperor. He entered a carriage with the Queen and the Princess Augusta under an escort from the Grand Headquarters. 2 days after his departure, the junction of the Saxon troops with the French army took place at Eilenburg on the borders of the Mulda. The emperor exhorted these allies, whom he must have believed faithful to maintain the independence of their country. He pointed out that Prussia was menacing Saxony and coveting its finest provinces. He reminded them of the proclamations of their sovereign, his worthy and faithful ally. Finally, speaking in the name of military honor, he summoned them in conclusion to take him always for their guide and to show themselves the worthy rivals of the soldiers of the Grand Army, with whom they were making common cause, and beside whom they were going to fight. The emperor's words were translated and repeated to the Saxons by the Duke de Vicenza. This language on the lips of him whom they regarded as their sovereign's friend and the savior of their capital seemed to produce a profound impression. We began the march, therefore, with confidence, not foreboding the approaching defection of these very men who had so often saluted the emperor with enthusiastic shouts while swearing to fight to the death rather than desert him. At this time, His Majesty's scheme was to fall on Blucher and the Prince Royal of Sweden, Bernadotte, from whom the French army was separated only by a river. Hence we quitted Eilenburg, leaving in that residence the King of Saxony's family, the Duc de Bassano, the Grand Park of Artillery, and all the equipages, while we turned towards Dubin. Blucher and Bernadotte had retired, leaving Berlin exposed. Then the emperor's plans became known. It was known that it was Berlin and not Leipzig towards which he was moving, and that Dubin was merely a point of junction, whence the various corps there assembled could march together upon the capital of Prussia, of which the emperor had twice possessed himself already. Unhappily, the time was past when the mere indication of the emperor's intentions was regarded as a signal of victory. The leaders of the army, until then submissive, were beginning to reflect and even permitting themselves to disapprove of projects, the execution of which alarmed them. When the emperor's intention of marching on Berlin became known in the army, it was a signal for an almost universal dissatisfaction. The generals who had escaped the disasters of Moscow and the dangers of the double campaign of Germany were fatigued and perhaps in haste to enjoy their fortune, and at last to taste repose in the bosom of their families. Some went so far as to accuse the emperor of wishing to prolong the war. "Have not enough of us been killed," said they. "Must we all be left here?" Nor were these complaints made only in private. They were openly expressed, and sometimes so loudly that they reached the emperor's ears. But in such cases His Majesty knew how not to hear. It was during the suspicious attitude of a considerable number of the army chieftains that the defection of Bavaria became known. This added new force to the anxieties and discontent arising from the emperor's resolve. An unheard of thing occurred. His staff went in a body to the emperor, entreating him to abandon his plans on Berlin and march on Leipzig. I saw how deeply the soul of the emperor suffered from the necessity of listening to such remonstrances. In spite of the respectful forms in which they were concealed, His Majesty remained undecided for 2 entire days. How long were these 48 hours? Never was bivouac or deserted cabin more dismal than the dismal chateau of Dubin. In this lamentable residence, I saw the emperor for the first time completely idle. The indecision to which he was a prey kept him so absorbed that no one could have recognized him. Who would have believed it? To that activity which one might say incessantly devoured him, had succeeded an apparent nonchalance of which no idea can be formed. I saw him during nearly an entire day lying on a sofa with a table in front of him covered with maps and papers which he did not look at, with no other occupation for whole hours together but that of slowly tracing large letters on sheets of white paper. It was because his mind was in wavering between his own will and the supplications of his generals. After 2 days of the most painful anxiety, he yielded, and thenceforward all was lost. Would to God that he had not listened to their complaints, that he had once more obeyed the presentiment that sought to master him. How many times he sadly repeated in thinking of the concession he then made. I would have avoided many disasters had I always followed my first impulse. I failed only by yielding to those of others. The order to depart was given. Then, as if the army were prouder of having overcome the emperor's will than of fighting the enemy under the sway of his high provisions, there was a general outburst of almost immediate joy. Every face was radiant. "We are going," they repeated on all sides. "We are going to see France again, to embrace our children, our parents, our friends." The emperor, and with him General Augereau, were the only persons who did not share the universal gladness. The Duke de Castiglione had just arrived at headquarters after having avenged in part on the army of Bohemia the defeat of Vandamme. Like the emperor, he was impressed with gloomy presentiments concerning the results of this retrograde movement. He knew that defections would increase by degrees on the route of our enemies, and all the more dangerous ones, because they were our allies but yesterday and knew our positions. As to His Majesty, he yielded with the conviction of the evil that would result, and I heard him and a conversation of more than an hour with the marshal by these words, which he pronounced like a sentence of misfortune: "They have willed it." The emperor, then moving on Dubin, was at the head of a force which might be estimated at 125,000 men. He had taken this direction, hoping to find Blucher still on the Mulda, but the Russian general had recrossed the river, a measure which tended to accredit a rumor that had been in circulation for some time. They said that in a council of the sovereign allies held previously in Prague, and at which Moreau and the Prince Royal of Sweden were present, it had been agreed that wherever it could be avoided, no battle should be engaged when the emperor was present, and that operations should be directed solely against the corps commanded by his lieutenants. Doubtless it was impossible to render a more striking homage to the superiority of the emperor's genius, but at the same time it was to enchain him in his glory and paralyze his ordinarily omnipotent influence. However that might be, the evil genius of France, having prevailed over the good genius of the emperor, we took the road to Leipzig and arrived there early in the morning, October 15. At this moment, the King of Naples was fighting with the Prince of Schwarzenberg, and His Majesty, having heard the cannon merely pass through the city, and went to visit the plain where the battle seemed to be in active progress. On his return, he received the royal family of Saxony, which had come to rejoin him. During his short stay at Leipzig, the emperor performed an act of clemency which will doubtless be considered very meritorious when the gravity of the circumstances we were placed in is remembered. A merchant of that city named Muldrecht was accused and convicted of having distributed among the inhabitants and even in the army several thousand copies of a proclamation in which the Prince Royal of Sweden invited the Saxons to desert the emperor's cause. When brought before a council of war, Monsieur Muldrecht was unable to justify himself, and how could he have done so when several packages of the fatal proclamation had been found at his house? He was condemned to death. His weeping family came to throw themselves at the feet of the King of Saxony, but the facts were so evident and of so inexcusable a kind that the faithful king dared not show indulgence for a crime aimed still more at his ally than himself. But one resource was left to this unhappy family, that of appealing to the emperor. But it was not easy to obtain access to him. Monsieur Le Borgne d'Ideville, interpreting secretary, proved willing to deposit a note on the emperor's bureau. Having read it, His Majesty ordered a reprieve, which was equivalent to a full pardon. Events followed their course, and Monsieur Muldrecht was saved. Leipzig at this period was the center of a circle in which fighting was going on at different points and almost without interruptions. The combats continued on the 16th, 17th, and 18th of October. His Majesty, ill repaid for his clemency towards Monsieur Muldrecht, reaped the bitter fruits of the proclamation scattered by means of this merchant. On that day, the Saxon army deserted our cause and went over to Bernadotte. 100,000 men were now all that the emperor had left, with 300,000 arrayed against him, so that if we had been 1 against 2 ever since the assumption of hostilities, we were now only 1 against 3. The 18th, as is known, was the fatal day. In the evening, the emperor was sitting on a red Morocco camp stool amidst the bivouac fires, dictating to Prince de Neuchâtel his orders for the night, when 2 artillery commanders presented themselves to His Majesty and told him that they were nearly out of ammunition. Within 5 days, more than 200,000 discharges of cannon had been fired. The reserves were exhausted, and it would be hardly possible to keep up the firing for 2 hours. The nearest magazines were Magdeburg and Erfurt. Hence, it was impossible to obtain supplies soon enough. Hence, the only step remaining was a retreat. The retreat was ordered, therefore, and began the following day, the 19th, after a battle in which 300,000 men engaged in a deadly struggle over a space so contracted that its circumference did not exceed from 7 to 8 leagues. Before quitting Dresden, the emperor charged Prince Poniatowski, who had just gained the baton of Marshal of France, with the defense of one of the Faubourgs. "You will defend the southern Faubourg," His Majesty said to him. "Sire," the prince responded, "I have very few men." "And well, defend yourself with what you have." "Ah, sire, we will hold out. We are all ready to perish for your majesty." Moved by these words, the emperor held out his arms, and the prince threw himself into them with tears in his eyes. It was a parting scene, for this was their last interview. The nephew of the last king of Poland, as will presently be seen, found a death as glorious as it was deplorable in the waters of the Elster. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the emperor went to take leave of the royal family of Saxony. The interview was short, but most affectionate and sorrowful on either side. The king manifested the utmost indignation at the conduct of his troops. "I never could have believed it," said he. "I thought better of my Saxons. They are nothing but cowards." His grief was such that the emperor, notwithstanding the immense injury done him by the desertion of the Saxons during the battle, sought to console this excellent prince. As His Majesty was pressing him to quit Leipzig and not remain exposed to the dangers of a capitulation which had become inevitable, the venerable prince replied in the negative. "No," said he, "you have done enough, and it is pushing generosity too far to remain here a few minutes longer for the sake of consoling us." Even while the king of Saxony was speaking, the detonation of a heavy fusillade was heard. Then the queen and the Princess Augusta united their entreaties to those of the monarch. In the excess of their alarm, they seemed ready to see the emperor taken and slaughtered by the Prussians. Some officers came up and announced that the Prince Royal of Sweden had forced the entrance of one of the Faubourgs, that General Bennigsen, General Blucher, and the Prince of Schwarzenberg were entering the city on all sides, and that our soldiers were reduced to defending themselves from house to house. The peril to which the emperor was exposed was imminent. He had not a moment more to lose. At last he consented to withdraw, and the king of Saxony having accompanied him to the foot of the palace staircase, they embraced each other there for the last time. Chapter 10. Nothing was more difficult than to get out of Leipzig, the city being surrounded on all sides with hostile forces. It had been suggested to the emperor to burn the Faubourg, where the principal columns of the allied armies were presenting themselves, in order to make his retreat more safe, but he had indignantly rejected the proposition, being unwilling to leave one of his cities in flames. And as his final adieu to the faithful king of Saxony, after having released him from his fidelity and exhorted him to consider nothing but his own interests, the emperor, on leaving him, had turned in the direction of the Rennstadt gate. But he found it so encumbered that it was impossible to open a passage. Hence, he was obliged to retrace his steps, to cross the city, to go out through the north gate, and to regain the only point whence he could carry out his intention of moving towards Erfurt by way of the western boulevards. The enemies were not yet completely masters of the city, and it was the general sentiment that it could still have been defended for a long time if the emperor had not dreaded to expose it to the horrors of taking it by assault. The Duke de Ragusa was still putting a good face on things in the Halle Faubourg against the reiterated attacks of General Blucher, and Marshal Ney on his side, still beholding the united efforts of General Wernzow, the Prussian corps under General Bulow's command, and the Swedish army recoil before his intrepidity. Even valor like this must nevertheless succumb to numbers, and above all to treason, for during the hottest of the fighting at the gates of Leipzig, a Baden battalion, which until then had fought valiantly in the French ranks, suddenly abandoned the St. Peter gate, which they had been ordered to defend, and thus gave the enemy entrance to the city. From that time, according to what I have heard related by several officers who were present in this affray, the streets of Leipzig presented the most horrifying spectacle. Constrained to withdraw, our men did not do so without disputing the ground, but in Irreparable misfortune was soon to make the emperor despair. These are the facts which signalize that deplorable day. Such is my memory, if it now recalls them. I do not know why it is, but not one of the great events of which I have been a witness presents itself so clearly to my mind as a scene which took place, so to say, under the walls of Leipzig. After having triumphed over incredible obstacles, we had at last succeeded in crossing the Elster on the mill bridge of Liedenau. I seem still to see the emperor himself placing officers on the road, whom he charged with indicating the point of reunion of the corps to the isolated men who should present themselves on that day, after an immense calamity caused by numbers. His solicitude was extended to all, as it was after a decisive triumph, but he was so overcome by fatigue that a few moments of repose were indispensably necessary, and he slept profoundly amidst the roar of cannon until a terrible explosion was heard. Soon after, I saw the King of Naples and Marshal Augereau enter the bivouac of His Majesty. They brought him melancholy tidings. The great bridge of the Elster had just blown up, and it was the last point of communication with the rear guard, still 20,000 strong, and left on the other side of the river under the command of Marshal MacDonald. "That is how they carry out my orders?" exclaimed the emperor, seizing his head violently between his hands. Then he remained pensive for a moment, as if absorbed in his reflections. His Majesty had, in fact, given orders to mine all the bridges across the Elster and to blow them up, but not until the whole French army had been put in surety by the stream. I have since heard different tales concerning this event. I have listened to many contradictory reports. It is not my business to seek to shed light upon a historical point so controverted as this one. I ought to limit myself to relating was entirely within my cognizance, and it is that which I have done. At the same time, I may be permitted to submit here a simple observation to the reader which has presented itself to my mind whenever I have read or heard it said that the emperor himself gave orders to have the bridge blown up so as to shelter his own person from the enemy's pursuit. I beg pardon for the expression, but this supposition seems to me an absurdity which passes all belief, for it is very evident that if, in these disastrous circumstances, the emperor had been thinking of his personal safety, we should not have found him voluntarily prolonging his stay in the palace of the King of Saxony, where he was exposed to a far more imminent danger than he could incur after leaving Leipzig. Assuredly, moreover, the emperor did not enjoy the consternation that seized him when he learned that 20,000 of his men were separated from him, and possibly forever. How many misfortunes inevitably resulted from the destruction of the last bridge on their route from Leipzig to Liedenau! And what traits of heroism, the majority of which will remain forever unknown, signalize this disaster! Marshal MacDonald, seeing himself separated from the army, plunged with his horse into the Elster and was so fortunate as to attain the other bank. But General de Mortier disappeared and perished in the stream while attempting to follow his intrepid chief, and so did a large number of officers and soldiers. They'd all sworn not to surrender to the enemy, and there were but few who submitted to the cruel necessity of becoming prisoners. The death of Prince Poniatowski was keenly regretted by the emperor, and it may be seen that all who were at headquarters were profoundly afflicted by the loss of the Polish hero. Details of this misfortune were eagerly sought for. Irreparable though it was known that His Majesty had charged him to cover the retreat of the army, and no one was ignorant of the emperor's confidence. Could not have been better placed. Some related that seeing himself pressed by the enemy against a river without a bridge, they had heard him say to those surrounding him, "Gentlemen, here we must succumb with honor." They added that putting his heroic resolve at once into action, he had swum his horse across the Place, in spite of the wounds received in a stubborn combat, which he had maintained since morning. Finally, we learn that, finding no refuge but the waters of the Elster against inevitable captivity, the brave prince had plunged into them without considering the impracticable escarpment of the opposite bank, and in a few minutes both horse and rider were engulfed. Such was the end, at once deplorable and glorious, of one of the most brilliant and chivalric officers who have shown themselves worthy to figure among the elite of French generals. Meanwhile, the dearth of ammunition obliged the emperor to retire promptly, although in the greatest order, upon Erfurt, a city richly provisioned with food, forage, armaments, equipments, in fine with every kind of munitions. His Majesty arrived there, the 23rd, having had engagements every day in order to secure his retreat with forces 4 or 5 times more numerous than those remaining at his disposal. The emperor remained in Erfurt only 2 days and left it on the 25th after receiving the adieu of his brother-in-law, the King of Naples, whom he was never to see again. I witnessed a part of this last interview and thought I observed a nameless constraint in the attitude of the King of Naples, but his Majesty did not appear to notice it. It is true that the king did not announce his hasty departure, and that his Majesty was ignorant that this prince had secretly received an Austrian general. However, and I ought to call attention to the fact, because I have had frequent occasion to remark it, so many blows, precipitated, so to say, one upon another, had been striking the emperor for some time, that he seemed almost insensible to them. One would have thought him wholly entrenched in his ideas of fatality. But although unaffected by his own misfortunes, his Majesty gave full rein to his indignation when he learned that the Allies considered the King of Saxony as their prisoner and had declared him a traitor precisely because he was the only one who had not betrayed him. Assuredly, if fortune had once more been favorable, the King of Saxony would have found himself the master of one of the largest kingdoms in Europe. But fortune was now always against us, even our triumphs being followed only by a useless glory. Thus, for example, the French army was soon to cover itself with glory it had now, when it was obliged to pass through and overthrow the numerous army of Austrians and Bavarians assembled at that point under the command of General Vreda. 6,000 prisoners were the result of this triumph, which at the same time opened to us the approaches of Mayence, which we hoped to reach without encountering new obstacles. November 2, after a march of 14 days from Leipzig, we saw once more the borders of the Rhine and could breathe with some security. After having devoted 5 days to the reorganization of the army, given his orders and assigned to each marshal and chief of corps the post he was to occupy during his absence, the emperor left Mayence the 7th and on the 9th slept at St. Cloud, where he returned preceded by several trophies, for between Erfurt and Frankfurt we had taken 20 flags from the Bavarians. These flags, brought to the Minister of War by Monsieur Le Couteau, aide-de-camp of Prince de Neuchâtel, had preceded by 2 days His Majesty's arrival in Paris, and they had been already presented to the Empress, to whom the emperor had offered them in the following terms: Madame and dearest wife, I send you 20 flags taken by my armies in the battles of Wacken, Leipzig, and Hanau. It is an homage which I love to pay you. I desire you to see in it a mark of my great satisfaction with your conduct during the regency which I confided to you. Under the consulate and during the first 6 years under the empire, whenever the emperor returned to Paris after a campaign, it was because the campaign was terminated. The news of a peace concluded after victory had always preceded him. For the second time it was otherwise when he came back from Mayence. On this occasion, as on that of the return from Smorgoni, the emperor left the war still in progress and returned no longer to offer France the results of his victories, but to ask for more men and money in order to repair the failures and losses experienced by our armies. And yet, in spite of this difference in the result of our wars, the welcome given by the nation to His Majesty was still the same, at least in appearance. The addresses from the different cities of the interior were neither less numerous nor more chary of expressions of devotion. Those who conceived fears for the future displayed even more loyalty than the others, lest their gloomy forebodings should be divine. For my part, it never once occurred to me that the emperor might definitively succumb in the struggle he was maintaining, for my ideas did not go so far, and it is only in reflecting on it since that I have been able to appreciate the dangers which already menaced him at the period to which we have arrived. I was like those men who, having passed the night on the brink of a precipice, learn the peril to which they have been exposed only when the day reveals it. Nevertheless, I ought to say that everybody was tired of war, and that those of my friends whom I saw on returning from Mayence all talked to me incessantly of the necessity of peace. Even within the palace, I heard many persons attached to the emperor use similar language when out of his presence, but they gave his majesty quite a different version when he designed to question me, which was not infrequently on what I had heard. I told him the exact truth, and when in these confidential relations of the emperor's toilette, the word peace issued from my mouth, he would exclaim several times, "Peace! Peace! And who desires it more than I do? It is they who do not want it. The more I grant, the more they demand." An extraordinary occurrence, which took place on the very day that His Majesty arrived at St. Cloud, gave some reason to believe when it became known that the Allies had conceived the design of opening new negotiations. It was learned that Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, His Majesty's minister at the ducal courts of Saxony, had been forcibly abducted and taken to Frankfurt, where Monsieur de Metternich, Prince Schwarzenberg, and the ministers of Russia and Prussia were then assembled. Their most pacific overtures were made to him in the name of the sovereign allies. Afterwards, Monsieur de Saint-Aignan was at liberty to repair at once to the emperor in order to acquaint him with the details of the abduction and resulting propositions, the offers of the allies concerning which I knew nothing, and consequently can say nothing, must nevertheless have seemed worthy of the emperor's examination, for there was presently a general rumor throughout the palace that a new congress was to assemble at Mannheim, that the Duke de Vicenza had been designated by His Majesty as his minister plenipotentiary, and that in order to shed more luster on his mission, he had just been entrusted with the portfolio of foreign affairs. I remember that this news was very favorably received because although it was doubtless the result of prejudice, everyone knew that the general public were not pleased at seeing the Duc de Bassano in the position to which the Duc de Vicenza was called as his successor. The Duc de Bassano was supposed to anticipate what he believed to be the real wishes of the emperor and to be averse to peace. We shall see later on. By a response His Majesty made to me at Fontainebleau, how gratuitous and devoid of all foundation these rumors were.